So what we're seeing is that for the class of 2016, for instance, 70% of that class had to borrow, and they borrowed an average of $30,000. And it's disproportionately impacted people of color. Because when you look at the Black graduates of the class of 2016, 85% of that class had to borrow, and they borrowed closer to 34 or 35,000. And that's because of the history of systemic racism and inequity in this country that extends today. It's also playing out in the higher ed financing space.
Well, I'd like to dig into that a little bit more. As you said, Black women are disproportionately impacted by the student debt issue. And as you said, this ties into the overall racial inequality gap. You know, if we look at, say, even home ownership, I know this is an area you've also delved into, that traditionally has been, for the middle class, a way to build wealth along generations. The Black community in the US and other communities of colour have been targeted by exclusionary programs, redlining, and also discriminatory lending practices. So when we look at those two things, how is that impacting families' ability to maybe borrow against equity in their home to send their young people then to college? And then how does that then manifest itself over multiple generations?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. So you've hit on a number of the key things, but I think because of this history, because of the inability to access credit, to access capital for generations, right? The Black homeownership rate, sorry, that's really loud. I don't know if you can hear that. The Black homeownership rate today is actually the same as it was before the Fair Housing Act was passed. It's also the same as it was before, even in like the 1890s. That's how low that ownership rate is. We're not having access to credit still, despite the growth of fair lending laws and other pieces. When you also think about the fact that communities of color lost $1 trillion of wealth in the Great Recession, most of that has never been regained. So when we think about coming into this current recession and the public health crisis, which is also disproportionately impacting communities of color, this is coming at a time when we hadn't even recovered from the first one. We were not in the same place. So everyone's like, the economy was doing so well. It actually wasn't doing well for everyone. It wasn't an inclusive recovery after the Great Recession. And so after the Great Recession, we lost $1 trillion of wealth. State budgets were also tight. And what you saw when the state budgets got tight was they took a lot of funding from their public higher education budget. That meant that more of that cost got passed on to students and families. At the same time, where students and families, especially families of color, had less home equity to tap into, which is traditionally a way, like you said, that people pay for college. And so the Pell Grant, which used to cover 70% of the cost of college at a four-year public institution, now covers less than 30%. So who makes up that gap? If families don't have the income and wealth to make that up, if their housing equity isn't there, if they've lost $1 trillion of wealth and they don't have home ownership opportunities, and you still have to go to college, how do you do that? Well, you have to take on student debt. It's the catch-22, right? You have to take on this debt and then you struggle to pay it off because of labor market discrimination, the fact that you don't have that wealth cushion. And so, for many Black families, we're not passing down wealth. We don't have wealth to pass down. We're passing down debt, and that becomes intergenerational. There's so many families where parents are paying off their own student debt still. When their kids get ready to go to college and have to take out student debt, then they have to also take out parent loans for those kids, right? And again, it's not really a choice because most of the jobs since the Great Recession have gone to people with some form of post-secondary education. So you have to go to college, but you also have to pay for it.
And are we seeing, though, this prospect of taking on such debt actually serving as a barrier for people to even consider going to college? And as you said, if you want to earn a certain wage in this country, you need to have some type of higher education. But are we seeing people just turning away from that because of the prospect of being saddled with an enormous debt?
I mean, I think student debt is impacting people at so many decision points. It's impacting where they go to college, how long it takes them to go to college, right? It's impacting the career choices they make. It's impacting whether they are able to buy a house, start a business, save for retirement. It's impacting whether they feel like they can start a family, right? All of these things. It's also, the debt itself. There's so much research about how the debt itself weighs on you mentally and emotionally, right? So there's so many impacts that the student debt has at every single process that folks are having to think about. So I think And that's what we're fighting against, right? And so I think, yes, some folks do think about whether they can, whether what this debt will mean, but they also think about the fact that there's not really a choice, right? If they want those good jobs, right? If they want those higher paying jobs, they have to go to college. And for Black and brown borrowers, they actually need to go to more than college. They have to go to get master's degrees and professional degrees, just to get the same earnings that their white counterparts would get for college or even high school degrees. So I think there's so many disparities across the spectrum that really come to bear when we think about the student debt crisis and how it actually impacts people's everyday lives. And it's also impacting our economy.
Well, let's talk about that. What are the broader economic impacts of this? Because you said people are holding off making major decisions and major purchases. So that money is not going into the general economy if people can't take on a mortgage or a car loan or buy big ticket items. I mean, that's got to have a knock-on effect for the broader economy.
Absolutely, right? So home ownership has always been one of the central pieces of the American economy, not just the way people build wealth, right? But also the economy. People build wealth through buying houses, starting businesses, and then that contributes to the economy. If you have 44 million people and growing who can't do all those things, the folks that you would think would be able to do those things, right? No one went to college so that they couldn't buy a house, so that they couldn't start a business, so that they couldn't save for retirement. The point was financial security. But if you have 44 million people who can't get that financial security and can't put consumer funds back into the economy, we're all impacted, right? The same way the Great Recession, right? The people who lost in that recession weren't just the folks who were steered into these predatory mortgages, right? When the house next to you is in foreclosure, that impacts your own house. So if we're looking around us and people can't buy houses and they can't start businesses, that's our economy too. It's not just the 44 million, it's their families and it's their community.